In the West, about that same time, a little later, you have St. Augustine. Also, for him, divine simplicity is crucially important. It's one of the central themes of his thought. And he agrees with Gregory of Nyssa. I mean, he has that similar idea. I don't know if he's read Gregory per se, but he has the same idea. God is not what he doesn't have his attributes by participating in anything else. But he also adds to it um, another way of articulating or sort of stating philosophically how God is simple, that God is identical with his attributes. How should I say this? Altogether, okay, for Gregory, yes, God is the good, God is wisdom, God is life. But those are ways that God manifests himself. Gregory uses the word energia or energies, plural, for those. And he says when we name God with these various terms, we're actually naming energies of God. Energies, activities, operations, however you want to put it, but ways that God is active and manifest that we recognize and name. Um, Augustine, since he doesn't have that term or concept, doesn't go that way. He just says, no, we're naming the divine essence. God is his own essence, essentia, and that essence that is also the divine goodness, power, wisdom, life. And in fact, he then goes further to add two other, or at least implicitly, one is explicit, that are really even more important. His activity, operatio, okay, and his will, voluntas. God is his own will. Now, that's where I think theologically you can see this is going to lead to some problems, because if God is eternal and unchanging, doesn't that mean that the divine will has to be eternal and unchanging? Well, yes, and actually Augustine does draw that very conclusion. He talks about this at several points in the Confessions. I think, if I remember, it's book 12, chapter 15, I think is maybe the most emphatic. Um, Eternal, unchanging, and furthermore, God, as I was saying a lot, God is what he is independently of his relation to creatures. Okay, because as I mentioned, he's already eternally full and fully realized, even prior to creating. He doesn't need to create the world to be what he is. Well, if that's true of God, then on Augustine's view, it's also true of the divine will, which is just one of the names that we give to the divine essence. All right. Um, and the implication of that is that God's will is not only eternal and unchanging, it's also sort of fixed fully from his own side without any interaction or response to what creatures do. Okay. And this, I think, is something where you can see the metaphysical roots behind Augustine's understanding of predestination, in which God's election, and he says this, explicitly and emphatically, is not a response to what creatures will. It's something that God determines, and then he gives grace in accordance with that. And that grace enables some creatures to will good, and those who do not receive the grace, they're not able to will good. And the point, though, is that all the initiative is fully on God's side. So you see how synergy has disappeared from that picture. It's really not synergy that he's describing. It's monergy or monenergy, however you want to say that. That it's just God's activity, God's will, God's determination that's behind everything. And that whole idea that we're active cooperators with God through our own free choice, I think, is what's lost. And yeah, that has huge, huge theological ramifications. And if you know much about the history of theology in the West in the Middle Ages, you know that this is something they just wrestled with repeatedly, because it's such a bitter pill to swallow, frankly. The idea that God just determines of his own initiative to whom he will give grace, to whom he will not give grace. Um, and I would think, at least I would I would add, I mean, this may be more controversial, that picture of God is partly why so many in the West have turned away from Christianity itself, because that picture of God is really deeply alien and just it's not a God you want to believe in. It's not a God, you don't want the world to be like that. And what does it say about yourself and your own hopes and so forth? Um, yeah, everyone, every Orthodox, little o Orthodox Christian believes God is simple. Um, he's immaterial, he's eternal, he's unchanging, has no parts. All that, that's common ground. The question is then, how do you sort of develop and articulate that idea philosophically? And that's where you get different interpretations. One thing I argue in my book, I mean, this may get too much into sort of the weeds on philosophy, perhaps, but Augustine describes in the Confessions in Book 7 how, for him, the crucial point in his intellectual conversion to Christianity was reading what he calls the books of the Platonists, which probably was less Plato himself than it was Plotinus and Porphyry, who'd been translated into Latin. And also in The City of God, Book 8, Chapter 6, there's a really interesting discussion where he describes what he thinks the Platonists got right about God. And if you read that, and if you know much about Plotinus, you'll see what he's really describing is what in Plotinus is intellect. It's the second hypostasis. All right, in Plotinus, you have the one, that's the first hypostasis, that's the source of all things. Intellect comes forth from the one through the process of emanation. It's not created. The one doesn't intend or consciously do anything, but just there's this process of emanation that gives rise to intellect. And then below intellect, intellect gives rise to soul. But intellect is simple in pretty much the way that Augustine identifies with the simplicity of God. And I talk about that in my book, but just the basic point is that he's not getting his interpretation of divine simplicity just from Scripture. This is a philosophical reflection. It has to be. I mean, it's a philosophical concept, and I think, in my opinion, at least, he sort of absorbed what the Platonists had to say about intellect, the second hypostasis. He doesn't really absorb what they have to say about the one, the first hypostasis. And that's another way in which you can see some characteristic differences between Eastern and Western Christian theology. That in the East, I think there's, in my opinion, again, a more balanced approach, because what's lost when you sort of lose the one that is beyond being. Okay, you sort of, if you don't incorporate that language as well, you lose the sense of God beyond any human concept. God, a mystery, whom we can name through his activities, through his energies, through the way he manifests himself, but his essence is always beyond our knowing. Okay, that's something you find in, like I said, Gregory of Nyssa, St. Basil the Great, and others. Again, I reference all them in my book. So they have this sort of polar view in which there's God as he is manifest and known to us and that we can participate in, but there's also what's always beyond. Okay, and in Augustine, it seems to me that gets sort of flattened out, and there's not that polarity. There's simply God who is his own essence, who is his own wisdom and will and activity and so forth. And that God who is not now beyond being, okay, Augustine rarely, if ever, refers to God as beyond being in that sort of a way that the Eastern fathers do so often. He's sort of more readily adaptable to a philosophical system. Okay, it's the kind of thing that philosophers then sort of take over and run with. This idea of a God who is perfectly simple in the way Augustine described, et cetera, that becomes really central to philosophical theology as it develops in the West. And, if you know much about early modern philosophy, people like Descartes and even Leibniz and Spinoza, they're still working within that tradition and that way of thinking about God. And frankly, it lends itself to eventually being secularized because you've got a philosophical concept of God as the supreme being that has all these nifty attributes like perfect simplicity and so on that you can philosophize about, and you can build a whole philosophical system. Um, and it gets pretty far removed from the God of Scripture. Whereas if you keep the polarity in mind, Scripture is full of divine mystery. Um, when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush and he says, I am he who is, that's not a philosophical proposition. That's warning Moses. You've asked my name. Here's my name. It's something that's beyond you. You don't know what that means. You can't define and articulate and philosophize about this. This is beyond you. This is a holy mystery. This is why Moses has to remove the sandals from his feet, right? And the very burning bush itself is a symbol, a kind of a visible representation of God as this uh, presence from beyond. The bush burns, but it's not consumed, right? This ever-living fire that's manifest, but it has its own inner secret of being that we don't know and we can't know. So anyway, that's very scriptural. And Scripture is not a philosophical system. So I think, this is sort of a big picture claim. I realize a lot of people might take offense at this, but I think Western philosophy, Western Christianity became much too philosophical in the Middle Ages. Um, and we're still living with the effects of that today. And if you read the Greek fathers, you find they just don't do that. They have a different way of thinking. So yeah, there's at least one other theme from Scripture that we haven't talked about yet that enters into this in an important way, the divine glory. Okay, and of course that too is so prominent, both Old Testament and New Testament, culminating, I think, with the transfiguration of Christ, where he's seen enveloped in this radiant glory that clearly whatever it is, it's not like the light you get when you flip on the light switch, right? There's something about that radiance that surrounds Christ at the transfiguration that is sort of the visible emblem, representation, or manifestation of his eternal divine being. And of course, in John 17, in the high priestly prayer, when he prays to the Father, he refers to the glory that I had with you before the world was, and how he wants his disciples to share in that glory. Well, this too is something that is so prominent in the Eastern Christian understanding that much less so in the West for whatever reason. I mean, I think divine simplicity is part of in the background there, because the way the West, or at least people like Augustine, Augustine has a whole in De Trinitate book 2. He has a discussion of the theophanies in Scripture, the places where God appears, um, like the pillar of fire in the wilderness, like the divine glory at the tabernacle and the temple, or like the tongues of flame at Pentecost. And the transfiguration, the light of the transfiguration. And he says, well, these are creatures. They're not God because, there's only two options. If it's God, it is the divine essence. Um, and so they have to be creatures. And he kind of speculates, are they angels that just took this certain form, or was it just something distinct that God created for that moment and then it vanishes out of being? But for the Eastern Fathers, these are manifestations of the eternal glory of God that he, through his, condescension, he makes visible to us. And he sort of transforms the eyes of the disciples so that they're opened and they can see what's eternally always there. Christ always had his divine glory. It's just that the eyes of the disciples were open to enable them to see it. So that becomes what in the East they refer to as the uncreated light. I mean, it's the idea of what it doesn't become, but that they give that the name. They call it the uncreated light. And later, during the Byzantine era, in Eastern monasticism, particularly, it's thought that prayer can be a way of sort of opening yourself up to that radiant divine presence. You find stories in like the early monks, the Desert Fathers, 4th, 5th century, of when they pray, people see this light around them. And, you know, if you're Protestant, of course, I was a Protestant at one time, this sounds weird. This sounds like, oh man, that's just wacky um, mysticism. But you have to take seriously, what is that divine glory? What is that light that radiates around Christ? And when he refers to the glory that he had with the Father from before the world was, that he wants to share with his disciples, what does he mean by that? So they took that very literally, and they thought that that's something too that we can experience in this life. Um, so I realize again, this is sort of, you know, walking on the wild side a little bit, if for the Protestant folks. But you know, just to take it back to Scripture, if you look at sort of the way theology developed in Western thought, the divine glory, that uncreated light of Christ, and they hardly talk about it. It's just not there within certainly the philosophical theology of the West, and it's so prominent in the East. That's something else that I think we as Western Christians really need to try to recover, and the best way to do that is by looking at how it was understood within the Greek Church Fathers.